The night of November 30th, 1942, off the northwestern coast of Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Rollin Westholme throttled back the engines of PT-109 to little more than an idle. The three Packard 12-cylinder marine engines, each capable of 1,500 horsepower, now burbled quietly in the darkness, their exhaust manifolds barely breaking the surface of the slot. Around him, in the moonless void, 4 other PT boats drifted in similar silence, their crews scanning the black horizon for any sign of the Tokyo Express. The men called them the Rat Run, or sometimes the Tokyo Express. The Japanese Navy called them high-speed transport missions, though that was merely bureaucratic language for what had become the lifeline of their garrison on Guadalcanal. Every few nights, destroyers and fast cruisers would race down the channel between the Solomon Islands, unload supplies and reinforcements onto the beaches, and sprint back north before daylight could expose them to American air power. The schedule had become grimly predictable. The Japanese came at night, they came fast, and until recently they had come with near impunity. Westholme had been at this for 6 weeks now, operating out of Tulagi Harbour across the Sound from Henderson Field. His boat, like the others in Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, carried 4 21-inch Mark 8 torpedoes, each weighing nearly 3,000 pounds and capable of sinking a destroyer if the shot was true. The torpedoes cost $10,000 apiece, more than twice what most of these enlisted men would earn in a decade. Tonight, Westholme had orders to use them. The intelligence report had been specific. A large Japanese reinforcement convoy was expected, possibly as many as 8 destroyers carrying troops and supplies for the beleaguered garrison. American coast watchers, hidden in the jungle-covered hills of the surrounding islands, had radioed the sighting hours earlier. The enemy formation was moving south at high speed, perhaps 30 knots, which meant they would arrive in the narrow waters off Tassafaronga within the hour. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The PT boats represented something new in naval warfare, or rather something very old made new again. They were small, fast, wooden-hulled vessels crewed by fewer than a dozen men, armed with torpedoes that could theoretically kill ships 1,000 times their displacement. The Navy had commissioned them in desperation, after Pearl Harbor had eliminated any illusions about American naval dominance in the Pacific. Motor torpedo boat squadrons were cheap to build, quick to train, and expendable in ways that cruisers and battleships could never be. But expendable did not mean ineffective, and the crews who manned these boats were learning, mission by mission, how to turn their fragility into an advantage. They had learned to shut down their engines and drift in the darkness, listening for the distinctive turbine whine of Japanese destroyers. They had learned to fire their torpedoes from ranges of less than 1,000 yards, far closer than any destroyer captain would consider safe. They had learned that the Japanese, supremely confident in their night-fighting capabilities and their optical superiority, rarely expected attacks from vessels as small as PT boats. Tonight would test whether those lessons translated into results. Westholme checked his watch. The luminous hands showed 2,300 hours. If the Coast Watcher's timing was accurate, the Japanese destroyers would be here soon. Around him, invisible in the darkness, the other boats waited. The sea was calm, the air was warm and heavy with moisture, and somewhere to the north, moving fast through the tropical night, the Tokyo Express was coming down the line. To understand why PT boats were hunting destroyers in the waters off Guadalcanal in late November of 1942, one must first understand the desperation that characterized both sides' positions on this remote island in the South Pacific. 4 months earlier, on August 7th, the 1st Marine Division had landed on Guadalcanal in the first major American offensive operation of the Pacific War. Their objective was an airfield that the Japanese had been constructing near Lunga Point. The Marines seized the airfield, renamed it Henderson Field, and suddenly found themselves holding a strategic position that neither side could afford to lose. For the Japanese, Guadalcanal represented the southern anchor of their defensive perimeter. Losing the island would expose Rabaul, their major base in the region, and potentially open the door for an American advance northward through the Solomon Islands toward the Philippines. For the Americans, Henderson Field provided the only land-based air power within range of the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul. Whoever controlled that airfield would control the air over the Central Solomons, and whoever controlled the air would ultimately control the campaign. The problem was supply. The Marines on Guadalcanal required food, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. The Japanese garrison, growing larger as Tokyo committed more troops to retaking the island, required the same. But neither side could safely resupply by daylight. American control of Henderson Field meant that any Japanese ships or transports attempting to approach during daylight hours would face attack by Marine dive bombers and fighters. Conversely, Japanese air power from Rabaul, while degraded by distance and attrition, remained strong enough to threaten American supply convoys during the day. This tactical stalemate produced the Tokyo Express. Japanese destroyers, fast and heavily armed, would race down the slot under cover of darkness, arriving off Guadalcanal after midnight. They would offload supplies and troops directly onto the beaches or onto barges, then sprint back northward to get beyond the range of Henderson Field's aircraft before dawn. The destroyers carried supplies in drums that could be rolled overboard and floated to shore, or in cases where speed was less critical, they would slow enough to transfer cargo to landing barges. The system was inefficient. Destroyers made poor cargo vessels. Each ship could carry perhaps 30 to 50 tons of supplies when configured for transport missions, far less than a proper cargo vessel. The drums frequently broke apart in the surf, spilling their contents of rice, ammunition, or medical supplies into the sea. Troops had to wade ashore or transfer to small boats in darkness, a process that resulted in regular drownings when men slipped while climbing down cargo nets or when overloaded barges capsized in the swells. But inefficient supply was better than no supply at all, and the Tokyo Express runs continued with increasing frequency throughout September, October, and November of 1942. The Japanese destroyers were fast enough to outrun most American surface vessels, and their crews were superbly trained in night combat, possessing optical equipment and tactical doctrine that gave them consistent advantages in darkness. American attempts to intercept these runs with cruisers and destroyers had produced mixed results at best and catastrophic losses at worst. The naval battles of Cape Esperance, Savo Island, and the first night of the naval battle of Guadalcanal had demonstrated that American surface forces were not yet prepared to fight the Imperial Japanese Navy at night on anything approaching equal terms. This is where the PT boats entered the equation, not as a preferred solution but as an available one. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had arrived at Tulagi in October of 1942 with 12 boats. They were Elco 80-foot boats, built by the Electric Launch Company in Bayonne, New Jersey, constructed of plywood over wooden frames and powered by 3 Packard engines that could push them to speeds exceeding 40 knots in calm water. Each boat carried 4 torpedoes, typically Mark 8 models with 500-pound warheads, mounted in tubes on the foredeck. The doctrine governing PT boat operations in late 1942 remained largely theoretical, drawn from pre-war studies and limited combat experience in the Philippines earlier that year. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance and the senior officers who had championed the motor torpedo boat concept envisioned these vessels operating in specific tactical circumstances, attacking large enemy warships or transports in restricted waters, conducting raids on enemy harbors and anchorages, or serving as high-speed scouts for larger fleet units. The reality at Guadalcanal matched none of these idealized scenarios. The PT boats were not attacking slow merchant vessels in harbors. They were attempting to intercept destroyers capable of 35 knots, crewed by men who had trained extensively in night combat, equipped with superior optical rangefinders and searchlights, and armed with 5-inch guns that could obliterate a PT boat with a single direct hit. The tactical problem was not theoretical. It was lethally immediate. The Mark 8 torpedo itself presented complications that training had not fully addressed. The weapon ran on compressed air, leaving a visible wake of bubbles that experienced lookouts could spot even at night when conditions were favorable. The torpedoes' range was 6,000 yards at a speed of 36 knots, but firing at maximum range meant the target would have ample time to maneuver. The effective range, based on early war experience, was closer to 1,000 yards, which required PT boats to close to point-blank range by destroyer standards before launching their weapons. The boats themselves were fragile in ways that their wooden construction could not hide. Plywood and mahogany made them lightweight and fast, but a single 5-inch shell would pass through both sides of the hull without detonating, leaving massive holes that would flood the boat in minutes. The 50 caliber machine guns mounted on the boats, typically 4 of them in various positions, could damage a destroyer's superstructure or kill exposed crew members. But they could not penetrate armor or knock out gun turrets. In any sustained exchange of fire, the PT boat would lose. This meant that PT boat tactics at Guadalcanal evolved through necessity rather than doctrine. The crews learned to operate with engines at idle, sometimes shutting down entirely to listen for enemy ships. They learned to use the shoreline as a backdrop, positioning themselves so that enemy ships would be silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky near the horizon. They learned to fire torpedoes and immediately turn away at maximum speed, using smoke generators to cover their retreat and prevent the enemy from accurately tracking their position. They also learned to accept failure as the norm rather than the exception. Through October and most of November, PT boat attacks on the Tokyo Express had produced minimal results. Torpedoes missed their targets in the darkness. Boats were caught by searchlights and forced to retreat under fire before they could launch. Communication problems meant that boats would arrive at intercept positions too early or too late, missing the enemy convoy entirely. The squadron's war diary for those months recorded consistent patrol activity but few confirmed hits. The crews understood their position in the naval hierarchy. They were not fleet units. They were not even proper warships in the estimation of many senior officers who viewed motor torpedo boats as experimental at best and wasteful at worst. Their primary value was presence, the knowledge that American forces were attempting to contest the Tokyo Express runs, even when conventional surface units could not safely operate in the confined waters of Iron Bottom Sound after dark. But presence without results bred frustration, particularly among the crews who spent their nights drifting in darkness, breathing gasoline fumes from their engines, watching Japanese destroyers race past, and returning to base with torpedoes still mounted in their tubes. The psychological toll of repeated missions without success, combined with the knowledge that the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal continued to grow stronger with each successful supply run, created a sense of futility that no amount of courage could fully overcome. November 30th would be different, though Westholm and his crew had no way of knowing this as they drifted in the darkness off Tassafaronga. The difference would not come from new equipment or revised doctrine. It would come from circumstance, from the specific tactical situation that would develop in the next hour, and from the decisions that individual boat commanders would make when faced with targets moving through their patrol area at high speed. The Tokyo Express was coming, and for once, the PT boats would be in the right place at the right time. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 arrived at Tulagi aboard the seaplane tender USS Mackinac on October 12, 1942. The squadron consisted of 12 Elco 80-foot boats, divided into 2 divisions of 6 boats each. Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery commanded the squadron, with Lieutenant Westholm serving as executive officer and commanding the 2nd Division. The boats themselves were relatively new, most having been completed within the previous 6 months at Elco's Bayonne facility. Each boat measured exactly 80 feet in length, with a beam of 20 feet and 8 inches. The hull was constructed from 2 layers of mahogany planking, each 5/8 of an inch thick, laid over white oak frames spaced 9 inches apart. The double planking ran diagonally in opposite directions, creating a structure that was simultaneously lightweight and surprisingly strong in longitudinal stress. The entire hull was fastened together with thousands of bronze screws and copper rivets, materials chosen because they would not corrode in salt water. 3 Packard 4M 2500 engines powered each boat, marinized versions of the 12-cylinder aircraft engines that Packard had developed under license from Liberty. Each engine displaced 2,500 cubic inches and produced 1,500 brake horsepower at 2,400 revolutions per minute. The engines burned high-octane aviation gasoline, 100 octane, which was significantly more volatile than the fuel oil used by larger warships. Each boat carried 3,000 gallons of this gasoline in self-sealing tanks, enough for roughly 500 nautical miles at cruising speed, or about 12 hours of continuous operation. The main armament consisted of 4 21-inch torpedo tubes mounted on the foredeck. The standard loadout was Mark 8 torpedoes, each 20 feet and 7 inches long, weighing 2,615 pounds, including the 500-pound Torpex warhead. The Mark 8 ran on compressed air stored in a flask at 2,600 pounds per square inch. After launch, the torpedo would accelerate to its preset speed, either 27 knots for maximum range of 16,000 yards or 36 knots for a range of 6,000 yards. In practice, PT boats at Guadalcanal typically set their torpedoes for the higher speed setting, accepting reduced range in exchange for less time for the target to maneuver. Secondary armament varied somewhat between boats, but the standard configuration included 4 Browning, 50 caliber M2 machine guns. 2 were typically mounted on the foredeck forward of the torpedo tubes, 1 on each side. 2 more were mounted aft, 1 on each side of the cockpit or day cabin. Each gun could fire between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, depending on the specific model and condition. The 50 caliber round could penetrate light armor at ranges under 500 yards and was effective against aircraft, small craft, and exposed personnel on larger ships. The crew complement was typically 2 officers and 9 enlisted men. The commanding officer, usually a lieutenant or lieutenant junior grade, stood in the cockpit alongside the helmsman during combat operations. The executive officer, often an ensign, typically manned one of the machine gun positions or supervised the torpedo crew. The engineering crew consisted of 3 men, 1 for each engine, responsible for monitoring temperature, oil pressure, and fuel flow during high-speed operations. The remaining crew members served as lookouts, torpedo men, gunners, and radio men as needed. Training for PT boat duty had been compressed by the urgency of war. Most officers had attended a brief course at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron's training center in Melville, Rhode Island, where they learned basic seamanship, torpedo tactics, and engine maintenance. The course lasted only 8 weeks, far shorter than the training required for officers serving aboard destroyers or cruisers. Enlisted men received even less formal instruction, often learning their duties through on-the-job training after reporting to their squadrons. This abbreviated training reflected the Navy's desperate need for PT boats in the Pacific, but it also meant that crews arrived at combat zones with minimal practical experience. Lieutenant Westholm had been operating PT boats for less than 6 months before arriving at Guadalcanal. Many of his crew members had never been to sea before joining the Navy. They learned through repetition and observation, through the accumulated small failures that did not result in death, and through the advice of the few men who had survived combat in the Philippines earlier that year. The maintenance requirements for PT boats were substantial and constant. The Packard engines required careful attention, particularly in the tropical environment of the South Pacific, where heat, humidity, and salt spray accelerated corrosion and degraded lubricants. Each engine had to be thoroughly inspected after every patrol, with oil changed, spark plugs examined, and cooling systems flushed. The wooden hulls absorbed water and required regular drying and treatment to prevent rot. The plywood decks, despite being sealed with multiple coats of marine varnish, would begin to delaminate after a few months of exposure to tropical sun and salt water. The base at Tulagi provided minimal support facilities. There was no proper dry dock, no machine shop capable of major engine overhauls, and no stockpile of replacement parts. When engines failed, which they did with disturbing regularity, repair crews had to improvise solutions using whatever materials were available. When hulls were damaged by running aground or by enemy fire, repairs were accomplished with plywood patches and whatever adhesives could be obtained. The boats that conducted patrols in late November of 1942 were not the pristine vessels that had arrived from the United States weeks earlier. They were increasingly worn machines maintained through ingenuity and determination by crews who understood that mechanical failure at sea could be as fatal as enemy action. The sound reached PT-109 first as a distant, rhythmic thrumming, barely audible over the idle of the boat's own engines. Westholme raised his hand, signalling for complete silence. The engineman immediately shut down all 3 Packards. In the sudden quiet, the sound became clearer, the high-pitched turbine whine of destroyer propulsion systems running at high speed. The Tokyo Express had arrived. Westholme could see nothing yet. The night was moonless, with heavy cloud cover obscuring even the stars, but the sound was unmistakable and growing steadily louder. He picked up the radio handset and transmitted a brief contact report to the other boats in his division, giving his best estimate of the enemy's bearing and range based purely on sound. The other boats acknowledged in whispers over the radio circuit. The first visual contact came perhaps 2 minutes later, when one of the lookouts spotted a darker mass moving against the black horizon to the northwest. Then another. Then several more. The Japanese formation was larger than expected, at least 8 destroyers running in column formation at high speed. They were perhaps 4,000 yards distant, moving at what appeared to be close to 30 knots, heading almost directly toward the PT boat's position. Westholme made his decision quickly. The geometry was nearly perfect. The destroyers would pass within 1,000 yards of his position if they maintained their current course and speed. At this range, and with the enemy's high speed, he would get exactly 1 shot. He ordered the engineman to restart the engines but keep them at idle. He would need power immediately after firing to turn away and escape before the destroyers could bring their guns to bear. The Mark 8 torpedoes had already been set for high speed, 36 knots, with a depth setting of 10 feet. The depth was critical. Set too shallow, and the torpedoes might porpoise or broach the surface. Set too deep, and they would run harmlessly beneath the destroyers' hulls. 10 feet represented the best compromise based on intelligence about Japanese destroyer draft and the estimated sea state. The range continued to close. 3,000 yards, 2,500, 2,000. Westholme waited, fighting the urge to fire too early. The textbook firing solution called for launching at 1,000 yards, but that assumed good visibility and accurate range estimation. In this darkness, with only the vague silhouettes of the destroyers visible against the horizon, range estimation was more guesswork than science. At approximately 1,200 yards, Westholme gave the order to fire. The torpedo tubes released compressed air with a sharp hiss, and the first Mark 8 dropped into the water with a heavy splash. 3 seconds later, the second torpedo launched, then the third. The fourth and final torpedo hung up briefly in its tube before the torpedo men managed to clear the obstruction and launch it manually. By the time the fourth torpedo entered the water, the first had already travelled several hundred yards toward the enemy column. Westholme immediately ordered full power. The 3 Packards roared to life, and PT-109 surged forward, turning hard to starboard to put distance between the boat and the enemy destroyers. The other boats in the division were also firing now, their torpedo launches visible as brief flashes of white water in the darkness. Within perhaps 90 seconds, 15 or 16 torpedoes were running toward the Japanese formation. The Japanese response was almost immediate. Searchlights snapped on, sweeping the water in search of attackers. Star shells burst overhead, bathing the scene in harsh magnesium light that turned the darkness into a strange twilight. 5-inch guns began firing, their muzzle flashes bright orange in the artificial illumination. The shells passed overhead with sounds like tearing canvas, raising enormous geysers where they struck the water. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Westholme kept the throttles at maximum, steering evasively, changing course every few seconds to make his boat a more difficult target. Behind him, he could hear the .50 caliber gunners firing at the searchlights, though with little apparent effect at this range. The boat was making perhaps 38 knots now, slamming hard against the chop, every impact jarring the crew and threatening to shake loose equipment. Then came the explosions. The first was a deep, resonant boom that rolled across the water, followed seconds later by another, then a third. Westholm risked a glance over his shoulder and saw a column of fire rising from one of the destroyers. A fourth explosion lit up another ship in the column. The torpedoes were hitting. What happened in the next several minutes would only become clear hours later, when all the boats had returned to Tulagi and the crews could compare their observations. The Japanese destroyer column had sailed directly into the PT boat's spread of torpedoes at high speed, giving their lookouts minimal time to spot the torpedo wakes and virtually no time to maneuver. At least 4 torpedoes had struck home, possibly more. The destroyer that took the first hit had been blown nearly in half, her back broken by the massive explosion of 500 pounds of torpex detonating against her hull. She was already sinking, her bow and stern rising at steep angles as the sea rushed into her ruptured hull. The Japanese formation disintegrated into chaos. Destroyers that moments before had been running in tight column formation now scattered in all directions, their commanders uncertain where the attack had originated and how many attackers they faced. Some turned toward the perceived threat, attempting to close with the PT boats and engage them with guns. Others turned away, seeking to escape the torpedo water. 2 destroyers collided while maneuvering at high speed in darkness, their hulls grinding together with a screech of tortured metal that carried clearly across the water. PT 109 and the other boats continued racing away at maximum speed, steering erratically, trailing smoke from their generators to confuse the Japanese gunners. The star shells continued to burst overhead, and 5-inch shells continued to fall around them, but the extreme range and the darkness made accurate fire nearly impossible. After perhaps 10 minutes of this running fight, the PT boats had opened enough distance that the Japanese ceased fire and turned their attention to rescuing survivors from the sinking destroyers. Westholm brought his boat around in a wide arc, maintaining a safe distance but keeping the enemy formation in sight. He could see at least 2 destroyers dead in the water, both clearly damaged. One was down by the bow, her stern riding high, likely taking on water forward. The other appeared to be listing heavily to port. The remaining destroyers were circling, lowering boats and throwing lines to men in the water. The Tokyo Express had been stopped, at least for tonight. The return to Tulagi took nearly 2 hours. The boats proceeded at moderate speed to conserve fuel and to minimize the chance of mechanical breakdown. Each boat reported its status over the radio circuit. PT 109 had expended all 4 torpedoes and approximately 300 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. The boat had sustained no damage and no casualties. Other boats in the division reported similar status, though PT 38 had taken a single 5-inch shell through her aft section that had fortunately failed to detonate, passing completely through the boat's plywood hull and exiting out the opposite side without striking anything vital. As the boats entered Tulagi harbour and tied up at the floating dock, the crews were met by the squadron commander and the intelligence officers, who immediately began debriefing them on the night's action. The initial reports were confused and contradictory, as after-action reports always are when they are compiled from observations made in darkness under combat conditions. Some crews claimed to have seen as many as 6 destroyers hit, others reported only 2 or 3. The exact number of torpedoes fired varied depending on which crew member was asked. What was not in dispute was that the PT boats had achieved their first significant success against the Tokyo Express. Multiple Japanese destroyers had been damaged or sunk. The supply run had been disrupted. The Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal would not receive the reinforcements and supplies they desperately needed, at least not tonight. The cost had been minimal. Some expended ordnance, some fuel, and one boat with a hole through her hull that could be repaired by morning. The intelligence officers were particularly interested in the details of the torpedo attacks, the range at which the boats had fired, the estimated speed and course of the targets, the observed explosion effects. This information would be compiled into reports and sent up the chain of command, eventually reaching the Bureau of Ordnance and the officers responsible for developing PT boat tactics. Each successful engagement provided data that could be used to refine doctrine and improve the odds of success in future operations. But for the crews, the debriefing was merely an administrative formality before they could address more immediate concerns. The boats needed refueling and rearming, the engines needed inspection and maintenance. The crews needed food and rest before the next patrol, which would likely occur the following night if intelligence indicated another Tokyo Express run was expected. The rhythm of operations at Guadalcanal allowed little time for celebration or reflection. Success in one engagement merely meant survival to face the next. The broader significance of the night's action would only become apparent over the following days and weeks as additional information filtered in from multiple sources. Coastwatcher reports confirmed that heavily damaged Japanese destroyers had been observed limping northward at reduced speed the following morning. Radio intercepts revealed increased Japanese communications traffic discussing casualties and damage. Reconnaissance flights from Henderson Field photographed damaged destroyers under repair at Rabaul and noted that fewer destroyers were available for subsequent Tokyo Express runs. The psychological impact on both sides was significant. For the Japanese, the realization that even their fast destroyer runs were no longer safe from attack would force reconsideration of their supply strategy. The destroyers that had seemed invulnerable to anything except major surface units were now vulnerable to attacks from small boats that could hide in the darkness and strike without warning. For the Americans, the success provided proof that the PT boats, despite their fragility and their limited firepower, could meaningfully contribute to the campaign when employed under the right circumstances. Commander Montgomery filed his action report on December 2nd, 48 hours after the engagement. His report was measured and professional, noting both the successes and the limitations of the attack. He emphasized that the favorable tactical geometry, the moonless night providing maximum concealment, and the Japanese formation's high speed reducing their ability to maneuver, had all contributed to the outcome. He cautioned against assuming that similar results could be achieved under less favorable conditions. But he also recommended that PT boat patrols be increased in frequency and that additional boats be assigned to the Guadalcanal area as soon as possible. The engagement off Tassafaronga on the night of November 30th, 1942, marked a turning point not in the outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign, which remained desperately contested for weeks to come, but in the tactical calculus governing Japanese supply operations. The Imperial Japanese Navy had relied on the speed and night-fighting superiority of their destroyers to maintain the Tokyo Express runs with acceptable losses. The realization that small, inexpensive motor torpedo boats could inflict significant damage on these fast warships forced a fundamental reassessment of risk. Japanese naval records captured after the war revealed the internal discussions that followed the November engagement. The destroyer Takanami had sunk outright, taking down 197 of her crew. The destroyer Naganami had suffered severe damage to her bow and required 3 weeks of repairs at Truk before she could return to service. The destroyer Makinami had sustained moderate damage from a near miss that buckled hull plates and flooded 2 compartments. The total casualties exceeded 300 men killed or wounded, an unsustainable loss rate for what was supposed to be a routine supply mission. The Japanese response came in multiple forms. Destroyer captains received instructions to approach Guadalcanal at reduced speeds when intelligence suggested PT boats might be operating in the area. Sacrificing the speed advantage that had previously made the Tokyo Express runs relatively safe, they were ordered to deploy additional lookouts, specifically tasked with watching for torpedo wakes and small craft. Some destroyers began carrying additional depth charges and small-caliber guns specifically for use against PT boats, though these additions reduced the cargo capacity available for supplies and troops. More significantly, the Japanese Navy began experimenting with alternative supply methods that might prove less vulnerable to PT boat attack. Fast cruisers replaced destroyers on some runs, their heavier armor and more numerous guns, providing better protection against torpedo attack, though at the cost of reduced cargo capacity. Submarines were pressed into supply service, carrying critical items like medicine and ammunition in their torpedo rooms, and delivering these supplies submerged during daylight hours when PT boats were less effective. Barges and small cargo vessels began making supply runs in larger numbers, accepting that many would be lost to air attack, but calculating that enough might survive to maintain the garrison. None of these adaptations solved the fundamental problem. Guadalcanal remained a logistics nightmare for the Japanese, a remote position at the end of an extended supply line that was under constant attack from multiple directions. The PT boats represented only one element of this pressure, but they were an element that the Japanese could not ignore and could not effectively counter without diverting resources from other critical needs. The American response to the November success was to expand PT boat operations as rapidly as available resources allowed. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2 arrived at Tulagi in early December with an additional 12 boats. Squadron 6 followed in January of 1943. By February, more than 30 PT boats were operating in the Solomons, conducting nightly patrols and establishing a presence that forced the Japanese to account for them in every operational plan. The boats themselves continued to suffer from mechanical problems and the harsh operating environment. Engine failures remained common, particularly among boats that had been in service for several months. Hull damage from running aground on uncharted reefs or coral heads required constant repair. The tropical heat caused fuel to evaporate from tanks faster than expected, reducing operational range. Crews suffered from tropical diseases, particularly malaria, which became endemic among personnel stationed at Tulagi, despite the distribution of atabrine anti-malarial tablets. But the boats kept operating, and their cumulative effect on Japanese operations proved significant. Intelligence estimates compiled in January of 1943 indicated that the Tokyo Express runs were delivering approximately 40% less cargo per mission than they had in October, primarily because destroyers were spending more time evading suspected PT boat positions and less time actually unloading supplies. The psychological effect on Japanese crews was also noted in captured documents and prisoner interrogations. Destroyer sailors who had once considered the fast runs to Guadalcanal as relatively routine missions now approached them with considerable apprehension, knowing that small boats might be waiting in the darkness with torpedoes. The cost in American resources was minimal compared to the results achieved. Each PT boat cost approximately $200,000 to build, roughly 1% the cost of a Fletcher-class destroyer. The torpedoes they carried were expensive, but still far cheaper than the naval gunfire and aerial bombardment that would otherwise be required to achieve similar damage to enemy warships. The crews required minimal training compared to the years of preparation needed to man a battleship or carrier. From a purely economic perspective, PT boats represented an efficient allocation of limited resources in a theatre where every ship, every aircraft, and every trained man was desperately needed. The success of November 30th established a pattern that would repeat with variations throughout December of 1942 and into January of 1943. The Tokyo Express continued to run because the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal required supplies and reinforcements regardless of the risks involved. The PT boats continued to intercept these runs, achieving varying degrees of success depending on tactical circumstances, weather conditions, and the specific countermeasures the Japanese employed. On the night of December 3rd, PT boats engaged another Japanese destroyer force off Cape Esperance. This time the results were less favorable. The destroyers had deployed additional lookouts and were proceeding at reduced speed with guns manned and ready. When the PT boats approached to firing range, the destroyers illuminated them with searchlights and engaged immediately with 5-inch guns. 2 PT boats were damaged, one severely enough that it had to be towed back to Tulagi. The torpedo attacks were hurried and poorly aimed. No hits were observed, though the Japanese reported one near miss that caused minor shock damage. The engagement demonstrated that tactical success was never guaranteed. The Japanese were learning and adapting, just as the Americans were. Each encounter provided lessons for both sides, a continuous cycle of innovation and counter-innovation that characterized naval warfare throughout the campaign. The PT boats' advantages of small size, high speed, and low visibility in darkness could be partially negated by alert lookouts, aggressive gunnery, and effective use of searchlights and star shells. But the statistical trend favored the Americans. Even when PT boat attacks failed to sink or damage enemy ships, they disrupted operations and forced the Japanese to expend time and resources on defensive measures. Destroyer captains had to choose between maintaining high speed and maintaining alertness for torpedo attack. They could not do both effectively. Time spent evading suspected PT boat positions was time not spent unloading supplies. Ammunition expended firing at PT boats was ammunition not available for bombarding Henderson Field or engaging American surface units. On December 11th, PT boats achieved another significant success, damaging 2 destroyers with torpedo hits during a coordinated attack involving 8 boats operating in 3 divisions. The attack demonstrated improved coordination and communication between boats, with multiple units converging on the enemy formation from different directions simultaneously. The Japanese found themselves illuminating targets in multiple directions, unable to concentrate their defensive fire effectively. 3 torpedoes struck home in rapid succession, leaving 1 destroyer dead in the water and another reduced to half speed with heavy flooding. The pattern continued through the remainder of December. Some engagements produced clear successes with confirmed damage to enemy vessels. Others resulted in near misses, torpedo malfunctions, or premature withdrawal under heavy fire. A few engagements saw PT boats unable to locate the enemy at all, wandering through the darkness while the Tokyo Express completed its mission and departed unmolested. But the cumulative effect was undeniable. The Japanese supply situation on Guadalcanal continued to deteriorate, not because the PT boats had completely stopped the Tokyo Express, but because they had made it significantly more difficult, more dangerous, and less efficient. By late December, Japanese commanders were facing increasingly difficult decisions about resource allocation. Should they continue risking valuable destroyers and trained crews on supply missions to Guadalcanal? Should they accept higher losses in exchange for maintaining the garrison's combat effectiveness? Or should they begin planning for withdrawal, acknowledging that the island could not be held against the combined pressure of American air power, naval forces, and the PT boats that controlled the night waters? The decision was postponed through December and into January, as Tokyo sent additional reinforcements and ordered the garrison to hold at all costs. But the mathematical reality was becoming inescapable. The Tokyo Express could not deliver enough supplies to maintain a force of 30,000 men in combat readiness, while simultaneously replacing losses from American attacks. The Japanese troops on Guadalcanal were slowly starving, their ammunition stockpiles were dwindling, and their medical supplies were exhausted. Disease claimed more casualties than combat, with malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition reducing entire units to ineffectiveness. The PT boats had not created this situation alone. American control of Henderson Field and the Marine and Army aircraft operating from that field remained the primary factor strangling the Japanese garrison. The periodic naval bombardments by American cruisers and battleships, though costly in terms of ships lost, prevented the Japanese from using the waters around Guadalcanal safely even at night. The Marines and Army troops pushing slowly across the island from multiple directions maintained constant pressure that prevented the Japanese from consolidating their positions. But the PT boats had eliminated one of the few advantages the Japanese still possessed: the ability to resupply their forces at night using fast destroyers that could evade or defeat most American naval units. That advantage was gone. The small wooden boats with their inexperienced crews and limited firepower had proven capable of threatening even the Imperial Navy's finest destroyers when conditions favored the attack. The psychological effect of this realization extended far beyond Guadalcanal, influencing Japanese operational planning throughout the South Pacific. By early February of 1943, the Japanese High Command made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. The official terminology described it as a strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions, but the reality was simpler. The island could not be held. The Tokyo Express conducted its final missions not as supply runs, but as evacuation operations, with destroyers racing to the island under cover of darkness to pick up as many survivors as possible before American forces could interfere. Over 3 nights in early February, Japanese destroyers successfully evacuated approximately 11,000 men from Guadalcanal, leaving behind their dead, their equipment, and any pretense that the campaign had been anything other than a devastating defeat. The PT boats were present during these final evacuation runs, conducting their usual patrols and attacking when opportunities presented themselves. But the Japanese destroyers, no longer burdened with cargo and focused solely on speed and survival, were more difficult targets. Most escaped without serious damage, though several PT boat attacks forced them to abandon planned pickup points and resulted in hundreds of Japanese troops being left behind to face capture. Lieutenant Westholm continued commanding PT 109 through January, before being reassigned to staff duty in early February. He was replaced by a newly arrived officer, Lieutenant John Kennedy, who would achieve his own measure of fame commanding that same boat in August of 1943 when PT 109 was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer in Blackett Strait. Kennedy and his crew survived and were eventually rescued, but the incident illustrated the persistent danger of PT boat operations and the fine line between success and catastrophe that crews navigated on every mission. The strategic significance of PT boat operations at Guadalcanal extended beyond the immediate tactical results. The boats had proven that small, inexpensive vessels operated by minimally trained crews could meaningfully affect naval operations when employed intelligently under favorable circumstances. This lesson influenced American naval planning throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. PT boat squadrons were expanded and deployed to theaters where their speed and torpedo armament could be effectively utilized. Production increased, with over 500 PT boats built by the end of the war. The boats never became decisive weapons in the way that aircraft carriers or submarines were decisive. They remained auxiliary vessels, useful in specific circumstances, but unable to fundamentally alter the strategic